Coming to paperback and e-readers, ISIS Legacy. The sorority secrets of the goddess next door are revealed in this all-new ISIS series adventure. Pre-order your copy of ISIS Legacy on Amazon.com today. The U.S. Supreme Court has declined to hear the appeal of Pennsylvania prosecutor Kevin Steele to get a conviction of sexual assault reinstated against Bill Cosby. Now, your Kevin Steele announced a couple of months ago he was going to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court to make an effort to get the sexual assault conviction reinstated that was overturned by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court usually does not hear cases as related to overturning an appeal from a state Supreme Court, so this effort by your Kevin Steele was seen by many in legal circles as an extremely desperate Hail Mary. And your Kevin Steele really did not have a chance to go out here and make his case, because the whole thing is that the U.S. Supreme Court needs to see that there were judicial errors made on the state level, and usually when they get these kind of cases, it's usually a defense attorney who makes these kinds of claims, and it's really odd to see a prosecutor making these kinds of claims as related to there being judicial errors. But the great irony here is that most of the judicial errors that were made in the Cosby case were made by your Kevin Steele, who ran a campaign talking about how he wanted to go out here and get Bill Cosby convicted, which created the first judicial error as related to the whole case. Because when a prosecutor goes out here and says that they're going to run a campaign to prosecute an individual, that shows bias, and a prosecutor's job is to go out here and present facts as related to evidence, not go out here and use their office as a campaign to target individuals. That violates a defendant's constitutional rights, because a defendant is supposed to be considered innocent until proven guilty. And state counsel's job is to go out here and ensure that they are presenting facts as related to the case, not prosecute a case based on their feelings regarding a celebrity. So that was the first judicial error made by the prosecutor, Kevin Steele. The second judicial error was made by Kevin Steele was using an affidavit in a previous case with another prosecutor towards the evidence of his case against Mr. Cosby. Now, Bill Cosby had gone and testified in an affidavit with a previous prosecutor under the term that he would not be prosecuted for any statements he made in that affidavit. And this was the core as related to the argument for overturning Mr. Cosby's conviction, because your Kevin Steele used that affidavit as part of his case to prosecute Mr. Cosby. And because he used that affidavit to prosecute Mr. Cosby, this was the reason why the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the conviction of sexual assault, because the evidence was used in that affidavit was not supposed to be used against Mr. Cosby. This was the agreement made between Mr. Cosby and the previous prosecutor, and it was on your Kevin Steele to honor that agreement, because if they did not honor that agreement, it would do serious damage to legal precedent, because that would violate the trust between a person who goes out here and makes a statement, and because it would violate their Fifth Amendment right to self-incrimination. So you would think a prosecutor like Kevin Steele would understand the Constitution and understand the Constitution's Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Now, this violated all of Bill Cosby's right to due process under the law, and this was the main reason why the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the conviction, because Mr. Cosby's constitutional Fifth Amendment rights to due process under the law were violated, as he was railroaded by your Kevin Steele and the Judge Stephen T. O'Neill in the courts, and he was convicted on a charge of sexual assault based on faulty evidence gained through this affidavit. So the whole case was one that it practically had fallen apart due to the numerous judicial errors by the prosecutor in this case, and it doesn't really look optically professional for said prosecutor to go out here and try to appeal said conviction in the U.S. Supreme Court, because optically this looks very embarrassing for this prosecutor to petition the U.S. Supreme Court and demand that they go out here and overturn a conviction based on their faulty evidence, because that to a Supreme Court clerk or even a Supreme Court secretary, this really does not look very professional. But your Kevin Steele was not very professional in the way he approached this case against Mr. Cosby. The way I see it, your Kevin Steele was looking to go after Mr. Cosby as related to a personal vendetta, and he was looking to go out here and violate all sorts of ethics to do so. I mean, when I look at Kevin Steele's whole efforts on this case, using that affidavit right there, this was a case of him violating Mr. Cosby's Fifth Amendment rights, and it was something that I saw as a case of something that you would possibly get disbarred for, in addition to running for office saying you're going to go after an individual. Now, in this case, your Kevin Steele also went out here and used hearsay witnesses, and all of these points, these all run counter to our U.S. Constitution. And again, this optically looks bad for a prosecutor to go out here and appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, whose job is to interpret the law as related to the U.S. Constitution, with a whole case filled with judicial errors that run counter to our U.S. Constitution. Because the way Kevin Steele approached this case would be embarrassing for any prosecutor, and basically he embarrassed himself by going out here and petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court to reinstate a conviction as related to Bill Cosby's sexual assault, when he was the one who made all of the judicial errors, and what he wanted the court to do was validate his judicial errors. And if the Supreme Court were to have validated his judicial errors, what would have happened is we would have had an interpretation of law that would have basically compromised the U.S. Constitution, because the standard of law that your Kevin Steele wanted to establish in this country is the standard of trust and believe, and the standard of trust and believe makes it where the opinion of a woman is seen as the truth, and this woman just basically can make any allegation, and a man can be arrested, tried, and convicted based on the very word of this woman, without ever giving that man any sort of due process under the law. And any due process that was presented by, as related to the interpretation of law on this case, would not be based on fact-based evidence. No, it would be based on the hearsay of witnesses, which is considered not to be admissible in court according to previous interpretations of the law under the Constitution. Moreover, his interpretation of law also means that you could go out here and violate agreements between a prosecutor and a defendant, And to violate those agreements means that somebody could testify in a trial and then be charged and convicted for the testimony they gave as related to previous crimes. Now, this would open up a can of worms as related to numerous cases all across the country of people who gave state's evidence and also cases of people who were a part of the witness protection program. Many federal and state prosecutors, they would wind up with their cases in jeopardy as related to deals that they made with individuals, as related to gaining their testimony to get another individual convicted. So that's why the U.S. Supreme Court went out here and rejected Kevin Steele's appeal, because it runs counter to our U.S. Constitution, and it also would jeopardize thousands of cases that many prosecutors had made under the interpretation of law in the United States Constitution. So what your Kevin Steele, with this desperate Hail Mary, wanted to do was he was asking the court to reinstate a wrong conviction, and he wanted that wrong conviction to become the standard for the law of the land. Now, this effort to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was an audacious one, but it was also one that showed us how incompetent your Kevin Steele is as a prosecutor, because to go out here and file an appeal to get a conviction overturned, this is clearly the ultimate state of desperation, and it shows how your Kevin Steele really does not understand how the law works, because any prosecutor who is out here who understands the law understands that if there is a judicial error, they have to take responsibility for that judicial error. But your Kevin Steele didn't want to take responsibility for that judicial error because he was in his feelings about Bill Cosby, and because he was in his feelings about Bill Cosby and had a vendetta against him, what he decided to do was go and try to file this appeal, thinking that his white skin would get him some favor from the U.S. Supreme Court, and as a white man, they would go out here and look to honor him as related to his appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. However, the U.S. Supreme Court knew its job was about interpreting the law, and they could not make it where your Kevin Steele was going to create a interpretation of law that would take the country off the standard of rule of law and put it on a standard of trust and believe, a standard that would practically derail the U.S. Constitution and derail Americans' rights to due process under the law, and prevent them from making statements that incriminate them, two essential traits of the Fifth Amendment that were undermined by the Cosby conviction, that are essential to our U.S. Constitution. Now, with the Supreme Court declining to hear Kevin Steele's appeal, the case against Mr. Cosby is officially over, because now that the conviction has been overturned, what has happened now is all of Mr. Cosby's rights have been reinstated, and he is now free to live the rest of his life. And he's free to live the rest of his life without ever having to have to deal with this whole case as related to Kevin Steele, because now that the case has been tried and the conviction has been overturned as related to the judicial errors, there is no way they can bring this case back again, and they could not bring it back after the appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the conviction. But with this Supreme Court refusing to hear this case and declining the case, the entire case is now over, and your Kevin Steele now has to take that L as related to Bill Cosby. And when I look at this case, it just shows me what happens when an overzealous prosecutor is obsessed with trying to go after an individual based on feelings and not on rule of law. And it just shows us how dangerous a prosecutor who is in his feelings about an individual, what they can do when they want to abuse the laws of the land, because this was an egregious abuse of the law of the land. And it was so egregious for him to go to the Supreme Court looking to reinstate a conviction as related to trumped up charges. And basically he wanted to go out here and push white supremacy as the law of the land. But this whole case, thankfully the Supreme Court came in and put a hard check to balance the legal system. So when I look at this case, I am really thankful that the Supreme Court decided not to hear this case, because it would be ridiculous to even listen to these kinds of arguments, because they would make no logical sense. But it shows, again, how obsession can lead to a person going out here and thinking that what they're doing is perfectly logical, when it just shows how deeply insane this person is becoming. And that's what I believe is happening with Kevin Steele, with his obsession with Bill Cosby, because to go to the U.S. Supreme Court with this case, this is not something a rational, critical thinking prosecutor does. No, a rational, critical thinking prosecutor takes the L as related to that case, and then they move on. That's what a rational, critical thinking prosecutor does. But when someone has an obsession and a vendetta against an individual, as I see it, they go and make desperate moves like this because they want to try to get that win at any cost. But the great irony here, as related to Kevin Steele, is that his quest to get a win at any cost was the thing that cost him his case against Bill Cosby. It was his obsessive approach and unethical approach to law that led to him winding up messing up everything as related to his case, because really there was no case there to begin with. Any rational, critical thinking person looking at the evidence as related to the allegations against Mr. Cosby easily sees that most of these women who came out with allegations against him were, when you listen to their stories, they were either manufactured, or in the cases of some of them, many of them were former women who were a part of the casting couch, who were aspiring actresses. Some were side pieces, and others were possible jump-offs, and many of them are now revising their stories to try to make it look like they were a victim in the hopes of getting the last 15 seconds of the 15 minutes of fame, or they were looking to get a payday at Mr. Cosby's expense as related to a civil trial. So a lot of the evidence here never really added up, except in the mind of an obsessed prosecutor like Kevin Steele. And now we have the U.S. Supreme Court finally adjudicating this case and closing the case for good as related to Mr. Cosby, and those who would try to make an effort to try to demonize him and try to destroy his legacy. They can't do this through the courts, and they're still trying to wage this war against Mr. Cosby in the court of public opinion, but their whole campaign continues to fail, because even new efforts by people like W. Kamau Dumbbell are failing to gain any sort of audience, because most people look at the facts of the case and they're seeing something that does not add up. So I'm really glad that the case against Mr. Cosby is finally closed, and this great elder can get on with the final days of his life, knowing that his name is in the clear. Now, if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, and my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up some of my positive black fiction inspired by men like Mr. Cosby on the SJS Direct imprint, you can find the books of the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find many SJS Direct books on digital sellers like Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. You think you've seen scares? Get ready for the horror of the Haida woman.